Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Questioning Behaviour.
My name is Sarah Bowen and I'm here with Neela Saldanha. Today we're going to be talking about all things behavioural science as usual. So sit back, relax and enjoy the episode.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying.
And today we're actually talking to someone who I am super excited about. So we're talking to Neela Saldanha about broadening behavioral science, and I can't wait because her idea of broadening behavioral science is quite a heavy critique of the current state of behavioral science, which, as we all know, I love a good critique.
It's very true. But I mean, Neela, we were so happy and pleased that she joined us on the podcast because Neela's so extremely well positioned to comment on broadening behavioral science and sort of the ways in which we can innovate and push the boundaries and improve the way that we do things and who we are as behavioral scientists before we really cement that professional identity into this neat little cookie cutter shape. So yeah, that's enough from me. But yeah, super well positioned, and we love Neela. So there you go.
I couldn't agree more about her being well positioned. So I don't know if the audience is 100% aware, but Neela is actually a hybrid. So she has work experience, she has a marketing and advertising background, but then did a PhD in this as well, but moving very much towards behavioral science. And then came out of the PhD and went back into industry, but continues to collaborate with academics. So this is absolutely great. This is what we love to see. But in addition from being very well positioned in that sense, she has had education in the US, she's been to the States, has also done work there, but is now actually working within India and has had many collaborations with the Pusara Center, which is based in Africa. So by this stage, she's got so much global experience from countries which aren't just weird, so this Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, but are just, completely different. And that is such an important part of applying behavioral science, because behavioral science doesn't work the same everywhere else. And of course, she is now an expert on that. And it's just amazing.
Right. In order to broaden, we really need to actually increase the amount of behavioral science that's being done and support behavioral science all over the world. I think there's just so much that we don't know. Like, we don't know really what is a universal insight. So there's so much work to be done, and we are so lucky to have people like Neela at the forefront, at the frontier of behavioral science, pushing for change. And it's difficult and it's tough, but it's needed for sure.
Couldn't agree more. So on that point, let's jump into the interview. And today we are talking to the absolutely amazing Neela Saldanha. Please, Neela, tell the audience, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, everyone. I'm Neela Saldanha, and I really like to use my marketing and behavior science skills. What I'm currently doing is to use them in pursuit of problems in poverty alleviation. So things like public health, financial inclusion, and charitable giving. But before this, previously, I actually founded a center, the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University in India, that was funded by the Gates Foundation. But before this, I actually spent 15 years in the private sector. That's where my marketing background comes from. So doing, brand management, consumer insights, sales and distribution, strategy consulting for marketing firms, marketing strategy consulting, with a number of multinationals, Nestle, Unilever, Accenture, Pepsi, both in India, where I grew up, and in the US. So that's the sort of lens I bring to behavior science, that sort of marketing lens. And I also got, somewhere in between all of this, I got my PhD in marketing from the Wharton School, and got an MBA from IIM Calcutta. So that's me.
Of course you did.
Amazing. So why make the change? Though a natural shift maybe, so from advertising maybe more to behavioral science and marketing towards behavioral science, but why make such a big change, I guess is the question.
So the first one, from advertising, from marketing to sort of behavior science. So I actually spent about 8 years working before I decided to go get a PhD. And it was interesting because I didn't know there was a PhD one could do in marketing. So I went straight from business school into marketing jobs. And I think it was when I was in consulting, one of our clients, we were doing some research, and the client said, yes, but what is the meaning of natural? And we would all give anecdotal explanations, right? Or look at this case study here and look at that. And I started to start to read about it. And I came across a couple of articles, one by Paul Rosen at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was like, oh, wow, people actually study this systematically. They don't just cherry pick examples and give and try and make some conclusions about it. So I think that was what set me on the path of saying, oh, these things can be studied. Even a field like marketing can be systematically sort of studied. So that was the shift from practicing marketing, I would say, to doing a PhD in marketing. And I was really fortunate. I didn't know anything about behavioral economics or behavioral science. So I'm going into a PhD program thinking I'm going to do something like branding or marketing strategies, stuff we were practicing. And my first consumer behavior, PhD seminar was all about prospect theory and all of this. And I have to say, my mind was pretty blown by that, right? I thought, oh, wow. And it started to make sense because unless you have a foundational understanding of human psychology, like how are you a good marketer? It's not just about making great ad campaigns, right? So that was, I think, the sort of aha moment that unless you really understand human behavior, you actually can't even be a good marketer. So it was great fun. And then the shift from the private sector to development took a much longer time. So after my PhD, I actually went back into the private sector. And I didn't take up a tenure track job. I got a couple of offers, but didn't take them up. And the reason for that is that I think I wanted to apply theory to marketing. I said, if all this stuff is so mind-blowing, and so many smart and intelligent people have worked on it, the real test is, does it make me a better marketer in practice? So let me try and apply this and see. I should have the secret sauce, right? I've done a PhD. I should be better. So it was really, and what better than like an absolutely great marketing company like Pepsi to go join? Yeah. So that's really the litmus test. So that's where I was in the private sector, really enjoyed it for about 7 years after my PhD. But I had been thinking about how can I have greater impact? Like, what are the bigger problems to solve? And that naturally led me down looking at development. I'd been very influenced by Peter Singer's work around effective altruism and how we can use our resources to do the most good. So I had been exploring it for a bit. And then I got this absolutely wonderful, amazing call out of the blue from, the then head of the Gates Foundation in India, saying that we're funding a center at this new university on social and behavior change. You look like you have an interesting background. And it was just a conversation that ended up in us packing our bags from Manhattan to India.
Wow.
2 months. I grew up in India, but I hadn't been there I would go every year. We would go every year to visit family, but hadn't worked there in 15 years. But it was such an interesting opportunity. Like, how do you apply behavioral science in its broadest sense to really challenging and complex, public health problems? How do you get pregnant women to take iron and folic acid supplements so that they can so that they don't get anemia, and so that their children can be a good, birth weight? These are things I didn't even think about. And I grew up in India as an upper middle class Indian. So these are really big problems, and it's ambitious and exciting. And so that was my sort of shift from the private sector to development.
Wow. Amazing.
Sounds absolutely amazing. No, it sounds really, really great. So I've always been quite curious. So I currently feel, although maybe misguidedly so, that behavioral science within the West is coming to a bit of a standstill, where the practical applications aren't as developed or as consequential as I would like. Especially because we're talking about a level of like, making men piss into a urinal with a fly sticker rather than outside of a urinal. So these types of things, this kind of nudging thing going on is not, and although effective, apparently, is to me not very impressive. But you just mentioned making pregnant women take the proper food supplements or nutrients to actually give birth in a healthy way. Now, this to me sounds something that has a lot of impact and can be very, very consequential. So would you say that when looking beyond the West, there is much more to be gained from applying behavioral science?
I mean, I think there's a lot to be gained. I agree with you that, the best known examples right now often almost make behavioral science trivial. I think that if we could get everyone to, to pee in the right place, it's not trivial actually, and it has, it has well-being benefits. Think about all those people who are cleaning the bathrooms, right,
Sure.
in the urinals. So how horrible their job is if people just are not careful. And now think about like sort of the increase in well-being that results from doing something as small as that. But
Sure.
What I agree with you is that we haven't taken a really problem-solving approach using behavioral science. So to me, it often seems like, and this is not the best behavioral science practitioners. I think this is, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. A lot of folks would take that as the new shiny hammer and find out, oh, let me do this cute little experiment, right? And that's all I need to do, or let me just implement defaults or implement, some framing, and that's what I'll do, social norms, etc. I think whether it's the West or not in the West, it's really like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And how can behavior science solve the problem? And this is where I think, my passion about expanding behavior science beyond nudging and behavioral economics, which are incredibly, so I don't believe that, nudging is useless. I think it has a definite place, but it's mainly to counter intent action gaps. But there's a whole lot around creating motivation, creating intent that, for example, marketers know quite a lot about. Things like, how do we signal identity? How do our choices signal our identity? How do things go viral, right? How do we motivate ourselves and others when they are achieving a goal? What things can motivate goal progress? And these are incredibly important, whether you're thinking about, I mean, at one end, of course, it is lives saved. So, of course, that is hugely consequential, right? But
Absolutely.
even if we're thinking about well-being problems, for people who don't have those life-threatening issues, I think there's a huge amount to be learned, but we have to broaden our definition of behavior science from just looking at, one nudge. We have to think about a portfolio of interventions, and we have to come at it as what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think a little bit of the interesting experiments has taken over that sort of basic, what's the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah. So this diagnostic role of behavioral science in that right at the beginning of deciding, not how do we fix a problem, but what is actually the problem that we're trying to solve. I mean, in that sense, is it always behavior that we should be targeting, or is it broadening in that sense as well, of not just looking at something with like this easy measurable outcome which we can sort of deliver on someone's desk? It's
a great question.
Bigger than that.
I think I would shock a lot of people when they would come to me, either when I was heading the center or even working at Pepsi, and they would say, let's do some behavioral economics work around this. And I said, I don't think it's a behavior problem right now. Or let me put it this way, everything is a behavior problem, but I don't think this is the biggest thing right now, nudging people, right? I think that there are lots of structural constraints. Do people have the money to do this? Do they have the time to do this? Do they have, the support that they need to do it? And if you can't solve for those, then let's not try and do all the cute little, nudges that we're planning to do. So I completely agree with you. And that's where the problem-solving approach comes in, right? You're saying there are some structural constraints, and then there are some behavioral, psychological constraints. And typically one operates with the other. I mean, the structural constraints influence. And I think too often we tend to want to find the clean solution. So we try to sort of, weed out the structural constraints. And that leads to that idea that then it becomes very narrow. So we're literally like, yes, I am looking, and I say this all the time, I am looking for my keys here because the light is better here, not because that's where I lost my keys. So we do end up in situations like this because we don't want to get involved with the whole problem solving approach.
Yeah. I mean, is it just because it's so difficult?
Yes.
I mean, I'm even thinking about any one of these problems and I'm like, God, I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, do you think that's one of the biggest barriers, that it's just too much of an unanswerable question sometimes?
I think it's difficult. I also think our training. So, behavioral scientists typically come from studying, say, psychology departments, come from, marketing, psychology, those kinds of, and it's a pretty young field right now, right? Behavioral science. It's not that old. And they're typically specialized, and not a lot of us have that kind of deep work experience. And so I think, and meanwhile, for the people who have the work experience, there are no good ways to actually pick up enough behavioral science outside of a very superficial knowledge. So on one hand, you have, very skilled behavior folks who may not have exposure or understanding of the broader context. On the other hand, you have people with that experience, but who don't really know that much about behavioral science to integrate those two. So I think there is an issue there, and which is why sort of putting together interdisciplinary teams is so important, because I don't think it's very rare to get that in one person. And I don't even know if you want to get that in one person. So the team is probably the issue. But yeah, part of that is it's complex, it's messy. It's, it's the things that require managerial skill, and you have to think about it and work with people. And it's not as clean as just the behavior problem context free.
Right.
Okay. Complex problems. Can't fit this, probably shouldn't fit this into a single person. Very fair argument. I have a feeling they'd be spending at least 20 years training and then still have no work experience. So that would be quite problematic.
Not everyone can be Asimoglu.
No.
Did I even say his name right? Asimoglu? You know who I mean.
Yeah, that one. So in general, given that you have so much experience and you seem to know what you're looking for, what would an ideal team look like? What type of people are you looking for to make sure that you can actually tackle these very complex problems? What do you need?
Wow, I don't know if I know the answer to that, but I think that I think definitely having I'll start with a behavioral science specialist, right? So, I've been out of academia now for about 10 years, and I try and keep up with the reading, but I just can't keep up. So, and with the replication crisis and with the sort of, I don't even know which findings should be, caveated, which findings are really robust. We know default effects, for example, are pretty robust and large, but lots of other findings have come into question. And so I think having someone who is currently an academic and that's their job is certainly an asset to the team. The complementary skill I would look for is someone who has managerial skills and experience. And that can be, depending on the problem, could be private sector, could be public sector, but certainly someone who has it. But it's really important for both of those people to actually have an appreciation for what the other person or the other part of the skill set provides. Because I think, and that's often bigger than so you might have someone who's highly skilled, say in behavior science, but thinks that all managers are idiots. I've actually heard people use this language. I'm very sad to say, I've actually heard people say, managers are idiots. If you have that, then no amount of working with that person is good, because you've brought that bias into the relationship. So I'd rather have someone less skilled, but who's willing to work and learn. Because I honestly don't think that in any case, you have to work on the problem. There's blood, sweat, and tears. It's not something where you come in and you have a brilliant, like Nobel Prize winning intervention right away, right? So in any case, you need someone who can persevere. So to that extent, I would say someone who has the skills, but is also open to collaborating. And importantly, recognizes that the other person might have a different skill set, but it's valuable. So from the other side, I've heard managers, I'm squarely in the middle, so I hear both sides. I've heard managers saying, oh, academics, it's just too hard to work with them because they're just in their ivory tower all the time. And actually, it's quite interesting because I think academics are quite deadline oriented because they have to often publish. So I keep saying, listen, they're not sitting and they're not, smoking cigars or whatever you think academics are doing and just growing old somewhere. They are actually quite what I would call quote unquote goal and business oriented. I mean, they have to write papers, they have to publish, they have to do things. This was actually quite an interesting learning for me because I had that same sort of stereotype of an academic. Oh, I would just get to sit in an office all day and I don't know what, but very quickly I learned there's like annual reports and it's pretty much the same cycle as you would think in corporate life. And many of the best academics I've seen are actually extremely organized, extremely goal-oriented, extremely wanting to get a project done. So I think that, again, for the manager to have that stereotype about an academic. And then there's the big question of who does what. So then there's a third party, which is what I call an integrator or a translator. I often play that role. Someone who knows both the academic side of things and the industry side of things, who can translate, who can say, this is what you are best at, professor, please do this. This is what you are best at, manager, please do that, and put it together and play that mediating role. That's the hardest skill set to find because you actually need someone with substantial industry experience and some academic experience to actually, or collaborations to understand. But and then of course there are various other skills that you would put together, but really academic skills, managerial skills, and then that integrator skills are what I would call the core of the team. And then you pick which academic skills and which managerial skills depending on the problem.
Right. And we have a name for these integrators that we like to use on the podcast. We call them hybrids.
Yes, that's a great name.
We've spoken to a couple of hybrids on the podcast, and it's been such an interesting perspective when you've got a foot in both of these worlds and sort of can see it from both sides. So hybrids are the glue that is bridging behavioral science.
They are absolutely. I think we need more hybrids.
I think I'm coming.
Yes. I think that unfortunately, my dissertation is actually about what we call mixed indulgences. So almost hybrids, but from an indulgence and utilitarian standpoint, right? Nice. And one of the things was that marketers think that if I combine hedonic and utilitarian, like healthy and indulgent, it's the best of both worlds. And sometimes consumers think it's the worst of both worlds, right? So that's the mismatch that happens. So I think the same thing with hybrids. If you're optimistic, you think it's the best of both worlds. But very often, I think the problem for hybrids is that both the specialties view them as the worst of both worlds. So you're neither an academic, nor are you like a manager. Who are you? And so I think we need a community of hybrids, actually. And we need to sort of bolster each other up. We need to talk about how a hybrid is its own set of skills, which is different from academic and different from managerial, and really create that community. So I love that. I'd love to know more and to connect to more.
Yes, no, I definitely think we need to build a hybrid community. I mean, I think what we've tried to do on this show is maybe voice or talk about different ways, people have reached the positions where they are now, because it's, do you start in industry? Do you start in academia? Right. And how do you find this middle ground, which is always a bit of an iffy ground, yeah.
And do you find that there are differences? Because I haven't found really. I mean, there are different paths to get there, I find. So,
yeah, we found a lot of. I mean, if you come from the academic side, you tend to have to be extremely well established before you can then make. Have your voice heard outside of the academic bubble. So these like the Thaler's and the Ariely's and the right at the top. But then it's mostly, I think, people coming from industry who have had lots and lots of experience, maybe even practicing behavioral science or not even realizing they were practicing behavioral science, and then trying to enter the academic world that sort of have this position right in the middle because they already have that industry experience behind them when they come to academia.
And I have to say, being out of academia, I mean, the nice thing about being out of academia is I'm no longer forced to read like the not so interesting academic articles. I can focus on the most interesting, most useful academics. And I actually think that there is what I would call the crossover academics. So, Dan is a great example. A lot of marketing academics are, who actually I could see them function really well in an industry environment. I mean, in certain industry environments. Certainly, I could see them function very well. They communicate well. Their ideas are useful. The ideas catch your imagination. You can read the same Journal of Consumer Research written by someone like that, and then written by an academic, which is looking at the 7th moderator and the 15th mediator. And you can immediately tell which academics would be good crossover. So I think, what I've also learned is that it's important to have that crossover type academic, the one who can actually go out and engage with non-academics, and not everybody can do that. And I'm not saying that that's required. Some people like it, they'll do it, they'll get better at it. Other people just don't like that at all. But definitely, if you're working on applied work, then you need to find those academics rather than the ones that you think are really well published, but then you find that they really can't get out of that sort of academic mindset. Because the rest of the people can't catch up then, right? The rest of the team then feels like, what is this? Who is this person? What are they talking about? I don't understand. They're not making any effort to understand my problem. And it just, ends in disaster.
Right. It's all about communication then. I mean, that's the hybrid gene. You've got to identify academics with that gene, I guess.
Communication and problem solving. So you still have to have an academic who says, like, yes, I know this little area of research that I do, but why is that important to your problem? Right? Versus an academic who says, oh, I'm so excited about, my area of research that you should apply it. So again, I think it's academics of this problem solving approach, and then have great communication skills, obviously.
Okay. Right. No, I like this. There's a little professional identity in here somewhere. We're going to pull it out for sure.
So then I'm quite curious. So what is your best experience or your best example of an academic working very well with a very clear practical problem? Or not maybe just a specific academic, but maybe an entire team that you've worked with that you were really, really happy with how it went, the process of it, but potentially also the outcome?
The team I've worked with the longest, and I really like working with them, is the team at Yale, the Yale Center for Customer Insights, with Ravi Dhar and Nathan Nowensky. So when I was at PepsiCo, my boss came to me one day and said, we have this agreement with Yale and these professors. And actually, I cited Ravi quite a bit in my dissertation research. So this is like, wow, I get to work with him. And I was a little nervous in the beginning, thinking like, are they going to be like really, academic? But it turned out to be a really good collaboration at Pepsi. And then when I went to set up the center, I actually reached out to them and said, I know you do a lot more private sector marketing work, but I think we could use some of your skills even in the development sector. And I just found what they're trying to do in terms of creating some frameworks, really conducting the workshops, being quite hands-on in terms of, we even ran a few experiments at Pepsi, being quite hands-on was very good. So I've had a very good experience. That was, I think, a really good way in which, and what they have is they have a mix of professors and who are very hands-on actually, and some managers, so some ex-consultants, etc., who keep the project going. So I've had really good experiences with that kind of setup. And then there are individual academics I've had extremely good experiences with. So, when I was working at the center, Christine Leguer, she does some work actually very interestingly on rituals. So she had done some very interesting work around, and this is where we need to broaden behavioral science, right? We need to understand people's rituals because it's so important when you're talking about medical advice. I'm really enjoying now. I'm working with Kate Lamberton at Wharton, and she's really an academic who is very thoughtful about how we might apply things and going actually beyond what you might consider traditional like marketing. So thinking about big topics like dignity and justice and power and empathy. And honestly, I mean, if I had thought about these things during my PhD, I would have maybe continued in academia and continued to research that. I just didn't think I didn't even think there was a path in marketing to talk about things like this. And then Ashley Willens at Harvard, who's actually got some quite exciting work on time use. And, one of the things we don't think about as much is time versus money, right? And actually, especially more so when we go to very poor and vulnerable populations, we always assume that we should, they want to just have things and material things. We don't really consider well-being. And one of the things that was so interesting is she talked about outsourcing things, even if you actually, it has more impact when you're lower income than when you're higher impact. So say outsourcing cleaning has more of an impact, and she's calculated impact on well-being. So even if you think you can't afford it, it'll actually have a better impact on your well-being than keeping that money to yourself. And ultimately, money is a means to an end, right? It's to improve our well-being. And so I think things like that are really interesting, and those are the kinds of academics who are quite interesting to actually collaborate with, and to because they are and I can always gauge when I reach out to them and say, yes, I would be very interested. Here's some things that might be good, and you can just gauge from the first couple of meetings whether they would be good collaborators or not.
Yeah. I mean, have you had a favorite project that you've worked on, or a favorite collaboration or intervention? Or I know it's hard to pick one.
So there's one of my favorite ones is at the center when we were working on this project around anemia. So the question was, how do we get pregnant women to take iron and folic acid supplements? And we were working with the government of India, and they wanted an ad campaign. So we said, great, we'll do an ad campaign, but we don't think this is the biggest problem. But it was very hard going to convince people that, you should do things other than advertising. So we reached out. At the same time, I think when you're running a center in India, I was like, well, if I reach out to folks in North America, it's a completely different setup, right? It's much more data and resource rich. I'll never be able to implement this. So I Googled to figure out who was doing this kind of work in the developing world, and hit upon the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. They're headquartered in Nairobi. So I thought, okay, if these guys have done work in low-income settlements in Kenya, they can definitely transfer some of that learning to India. So that is remains to date my favorite collaboration, because they actually came to India to help us set up a lab. We set up this little mobile lab, and it was quite interesting. We thought about setting it up at the university, but the university is a very elite university. So you can imagine if really poor people come to the university to take a study, and how that would work. They went around to the villages, the Busara team, and we originally thought of having a lab in the school or the community hall, but realized electricity is a problem, so you won't be able to really run stuff. So, it's little things like this that make you feel like, wow, you're really doing something real. And in the end, we set up this really cool bus, which we outfitted with 20 laptops, and we had arrays, and we took this little mobile lab around. And my dream was for us to have hundreds of these mobile labs all over India that we could just run studies with. So we ran 5 studies actually, on all the drivers of behavior. So right from, can we give people information about side effects, because that was a big barrier, and tell them how to mitigate that, to actually, can you remind them to take the pill, because they have to take it every day for 180 days of their pregnancy. And it remains my favorite collaboration because we learned so much. So out of our 5 experiments, 2 actually worked well. 1 we couldn't even implement because of difficulties with implementation. So we learned so much about what scales work, how to run these experiments, the results of this. And it was so gratifying, because then in future, when people said, yeah, but what is all this behavioral science? We actually showed them. We're like, we're not going to tell you. Let us show you some experiments we did. And it was actually pretty, now it's getting scaled up in a couple of places. And so I think that's my most gratifying experience, because A, it's on a big problem. And B, we did something new at that point. I don't think anyone was running these kinds of experiments. And it was really exciting to collaborate. Yeah.
Awesome.
What an amazing idea to have. I mean, are these buses still in operation? Are they still around?
It's very interesting. So it turns out the buses have licensing, and we learn so much. They can't go state to state. I think, I'm in touch with my colleagues from CSBC, and they're doing even more interesting work now. And how do you get people, how do you get panels of people, get data quickly, and so on. So yeah, I think, we are looking at what are different ways to reach people, WhatsApp
Right.
and buses and setting up pop-up labs and, what can you do? Because when I was doing my PhD at Wharton, I was so spoiled. I mean, there was a fantastic lab. You just had to register, say, I'm going to take 15 minutes next Wednesday for a week to run my study, show up, everything's done. They get subjects, they get people. It's just all so, and that was the idea. And that's partly why behavior science is so much work in the West, right? Because there is infrastructure. So you build the roads, you're going to get cars on the roads. Whereas if you have to think about building infrastructure, like, forget it. I'd rather just do the experiment in UK or in the US, right? Why should I go to India or Kenya and do it? So, Busara has a lab. I saw it in Nairobi, which was fascinating. It's just like a lab in any other university. They get people. They also go out into Kibera, which is the slum settlement. So I think it's very exciting to go to non-student populations and to try and run some of it.
It's so exciting and so innovative. I mean, it's obviously, there's a downside that you have to be innovative to reach these people because, there isn't the infrastructure, which is obviously a terrible thing. And, we actually need to be building infrastructure. But do you think like the model that we have in the West, will that work? Just picking that up and implementing it in other countries, or is there something else that needs to happen as well?
No, I think that, part of it can work. So the standing labs, etc. It obviously, the problem is it has to be funded and it has to be done and it has to be there. But there are research universities. I think the thing I find a little, I don't want to say wasteful, but I really have thoughts is when researchers fly in, set up research infrastructure for one project, and then that's it, right? I'm like, why would we just set up a lab at a university and then not only just this project, but others you can do? Then there's some other stuff around digital where I think it is, global South up, because if there's one thing that's happening in places in India, in countries in Africa, it's the digital revolution. So both in terms of reach, but also in terms of how people are using it and who's using it and so on. So I think, India and Brazil and, Kenya will have a lot to teach the US and the UK and Australia about how to use WhatsApp, for example, right? To run experiments or conduct research. And we're only just getting started. So that's the interesting other way flow of information and skills.
Yeah, no, it's so exciting. And there definitely needs to be this two-way dialogue. I don't know whether it feels a bit like a one-way conversation sometimes. But
it does. It does. Yeah. And I think the other problem is because we don't have, it's amazing. There really isn't a course in behavioral science, say, in a place like India. And you would think about like the billions there, right? It's really hard. So I ran a summer course, like a 5-week course at Ashoka University, just a basic introduction to behavior science. I had a lot of people say, okay, what do I do next? And I couldn't point them to anything except if you have the money, go to, UK or go to, and it's very expensive.
Yeah, such a barrier.
Yeah. And the problem with that is when, therefore, the quote unquote expert comes in from, the weird countries, as you call it, right? Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. People sort of just hand over. They're like, oh, you're the behavior. This thing is very like mysterious and you are the expert. So now you tell us what to do and we'll do it. What will end up happening, therefore, is you don't get enough interesting solutions. So very often someone will say, oh, I have this idea. And I'll be like, wow, that's really innovative. And, that's an example of this concept. But that's really innovative. And they don't even realize that idea is innovative, right? Because they think, oh, the behavior science expert from North America probably knows more than I do. So why should I say something? So I think that's the downside of doing sort of flying in projects. They're really good to set the template. But I think in the end, it has to be like, how can we democratize behavioral science and make it more available so that people can then add in their own innovation and creativity to these principles?
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I mean, it's exciting that there are people, I guess, like you that are leading the charge. I mean, is there anyone else, like any other key figures in the industry who are pushing for behavioral science and sort of establishing behavioral economics, like in the global South, that we should know about?
Yeah, so I think, recently we wrote this, we curated this article in the Behavioral Scientists about behavioral science response from the global south around COVID-19. And what was amazing to me is the kinds of responses we got. So I actually think in almost every country or every region, there are two or three leaders. So in the Middle East, what Dr. Fadi Makki is doing with his center is amazing, and really been a leader there. In Africa, obviously, you have the Busara Center, you have the center, the Cape Town, Amara Martinez is doing some great work with the government there. There are tons of other folks who are doing, and this is all I learned through, Margarita Gomez Garcia, the work that she's doing at Oxford, but also her work in Latin America. And then I was so amazed to find Nudge Rio and, some of those units. So I actually think that that they don't have, they do such great work and we could learn so much, but we need to amplify those voices. I'm just lucky that I know some of these folks and got connected through others, and I like connecting people. But they're the ones who do the work. I'm just connecting a few people. But I think we really need to know more of these people because some of this work is quite amazing, actually.
Don't worry, we're putting it on the list. Yeah, exactly. Sarah's making notes. I'm making mental notes. They will be on the podcast next. We do promise. Well, if they say yes, obviously. I'm sure they're quite
they're not
busy.
Like me who take 3 tries to get on your podcast because I can't figure out how to work the technology.
Third time is the charm. It's the charm. It's well earned now. We appreciate it even more.
So I then do have a question. So obviously, once you teach your 5-week course, and you can't then continue to point them in the right direction. The right sounds a bit off because obviously you're trying to point them to a proper behavioral science degree, which essentially leads you to say go to the UK, go to the US, or go to the Western European countries. Quite a few have behavioral science degrees now. So do you think a lot of the issue in this case would be solved by just having more behavioral science degrees in different locations all over the world?
Yes.
So is that a good enough solution? Does that already kickstart a change?
Well, I think it kickstarts it. But the other problem is that then what happens? Where do I get a job if I do this degree, right? So I think there is, we then have to go to industry, to development, to folks to say this is important. You need to hire these people. They have these kinds of skills. So I think it's picking the education leaders in a country and really working with them to say that if we start this, then what's the prospects for people who do this? Because that's what people wanted to know, right? If I do this, where can I end up? What can I do? And unless we do that part of the work, they'll get very frustrated because they'll have the degree and then not know where to apply it. So I think we work equally hard in that direction.
Yeah. So it's a structural problem again.
It is.
Yeah. Always comes back.
And part of this is just, it's a generational problem. So behavior science is so new that people who've sort of started working in the last 10 or 15 years are probably, have exposure to it. But you take my peer group that's working for 20, 25 years and they have no idea of this thing. And then, there's such a status quo bias. Why should I really change what's not totally broken right now? I really don't need to do that. So when you get that, you need a really clear pitch to senior managers and to leaders as to why this is important. And that's the other big difficulty, where it'll fit in their organization. I think you alluded to the why do we do these small things, right, rather than get big change. And one of the biggest problems is where do you integrate it in an organization? Now, if you're an Amazon and you have a website, you can run tons of experiments, right? That's the easy part. But if you're a CPG, if you're a Unilever and a Nestle and a PepsiCo, you already have a nice large machinery that's running. And the way it works is that, you don't run your own studies in these organizations, right? You typically talk to, a market research firm, even to do like qualitative research with consumers. It's not like managers are going out so you manage projects. Behavioral science is very hands-on. Like someone has to do the experiment. That means you have to, and this is my learning from setting up those experiments on anemia. You have to get a designer to do the stimulus development. You have to translate it, make sure it's translated well. You then have to run it. You have to actually make sure people show up. There's a lot of hands-on work that's involved, and unless you set up an organization to do that, how do you do it? But then there's a chicken and egg situation. Should I invest in hiring research assistants at my, should Unilever, they invest in doing this? Should they hire like analysts? Should they hire statisticians? Should they hire this? Like, what's the return on investment to do that? So then you get a little bit stuck in like, how do you actually make these experiments happen? Then there's the issue of what if the experiment doesn't work? How does it turn out to be a PR disaster? And then there's the issue of, which was quite surprising and actually quite heartening to me is, we think about corporations as just, it's just going to do anything in the favor of profit, right? But even they have a lot of rules and policies. So in fact, we couldn't run a lot of experiments because there were questions about the ethics of running experiments. And it was sometimes more like with academia, you can get away by saying, I'm just neutrally studying these populations and studying this intervention. That's what. So I don't know if it's a good argument, but yes, I mean, that's the argument people will often make, right? You cannot make that in a corporation because there are PR issues, there are legal issues, there's customer issues, all those kinds of things. So in some ways, I was quite encouraged by the fact that there are all these guardrails to prevent you from just unethically doing a whole bunch of. So it's not like these companies, by the way, at least my experience with working was that they're just, plugging your brain and figuring out all your unconscious brain waves and they're then going to, send little, it's not happening. But it's a big question. Where does it fit into an organization? Whether that organization is government, whether that's the private sector, whether that's a nonprofit, it's the thing that makes behavior science effective. That's not about behavior science in a way.
Right.
But without that, we're never going to be able to actually get it done at scale.
Yeah.
Right.
So is it more proof of concept that we need, or
it's the part after proof of concept,
right?
Which is now how do we actually integrate it into the machines? Proof of concept is relatively easy. You go in, you form a team. That's what we did at PepsiCo as well. You find some way in which you can run the experiment, and then you run it, you show some results, people get really excited. Then comes the hard part where you say, we'd like to do this. And then they say, well, I don't know, revenue, who can spare the time? It's not in our annual plan. Whose performance objective is it? So it's that part actually, right after the proof of concept, when people go, okay, this is interesting. You've now demonstrated to me, so I'm convinced, but it's just too much work to get it mainstreamed into the organization.
That's so interesting. I mean, I there's always this, this line being peddled about behavioral science that it's, these low cost interventions and it's all research backed. And, why wouldn't you? The cost benefit analysis is staggering, but actually getting all these people on board, making these structural changes is a huge barrier. It's a huge costly barrier.
That's a great point. And, when we say that it's relatively costless, we just mean the cost of the intervention itself. But we're not talking about all the time and cognitive and effort costs and money costs to actually get that intervention going. And that's, that is a little bit of where the discussion between the academics who say, oh, it's low cost, and the manager who says, actually, it's not low cost. It falls through the cracks a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not that low cost, you're right.
Yes, well, high upfront costs.
Costs. So when we did our anemia studies, and I thought, we're going to do this. We're going to get data 2 weeks. We're going to analyze it. That's going to be amazing. It took 5 or 7 months because every day there was some new spanner in the works. Right. But the next round would take a shorter time. And then the next round takes a much shorter time. So you're right. There's very high upfront learning costs, setup costs that you really can't make that much of a big business case for because we haven't seen those business cases because no one's doing them. And so you really have to have someone who believes in it to be able to do that.
I love how we just floored the main selling point of a nudge. It's cheap and quick. No, it is not. No, it is not.
Well, nudges might be, but behavioral science in practice.
Yeah, but even then, I think getting, changing a letter, changing a line in a letter, sending it out to people, it's not as easy as we think it is. But what they're
Yeah.
great at, I think, is getting people's enthusiasm and giving them very concrete ideas, so when I was at PepsiCo, actually, of course, the consumer insights folks were very excited about this, but the data folks are very excited about this, the folks
Okay.
who handle analytics and data. And the reason for that is they said, so far all you guys come and tell us, oh, consumers have these deep needs and these, whatevers, and we can never figure out whether you're selling us snake oil or whether this is actually true. You have no evidence to back it up. They loved the experiments because they felt that, okay, now I can actually test something, and if it's right, it's right, and the numbers don't lie. Now, right or wrong, we know that there's a lot more nuance to that. So it actually helps to get the hard-nosed business people around to saying that it's not just that I'm going to tell you an interesting story, but that I can test this out. And if it doesn't show any result, then it doesn't show any result. And that's what's so convincing, I think. And a lot of people say to me, what's different than what we were doing in marketing or what we've learned in advertising? And I think this is the difference, that you can show in very small ways, maybe not realistically, but you can still show, okay, we did this and we did that. And, these people got this, those people got that. And here's the difference that it made. And it's very convincing.
Right, it's that causality. It's so satisfying when you can prove or disprove a relationship. I mean...
And then the other one is that all experiments are tiny little stories, right? And people love stories. So imagine you're saying, well, let me tell you about this framework of consumer needs that I have. Point 1, 2, 3, 4, everyone's yawning by the time we've got to the fifth one, and they can't tell whether, need for this is better than need for that. But imagine you're now telling them a story about, let me tell you that people have this inherent need for uniqueness that clashes with their need for social conformity. And like when people order at a restaurant, they often don't order what the other person's ordering. And let me give you this experiment, which I think Dan Ariely actually conducted. And then suddenly everyone's like, oh, wow, like, yeah, that either they say that's me, or they say, oh, I could see how that would work out. Or so, every experiment is a tiny little story that makes it so much more compelling as a sales pitch to say,
right. Right. When science is good, it's telling a story, right? When it's bad, it's also putting you to sleep. But
yes.
Yeah.
So Neela, one of the things I really want to get back into is something that you've mentioned a couple of times now, but it's the broadening of behavioral science. So when you do say that, what exactly do you mean by it?
I think it's a few things. So first of all, it's the bringing in of other disciplines into behavior science. And I think that, for example, the discipline that I sort of grew up in, marketing, there's amazing work on variety seeking. There's amazing work on identity signaling. There's amazing work on goals and goal progress. All of this can help us understand, why people behave the way that they do. And together with the classic sort of defaults and other nudges can actually help us get somewhere. If you look at sociology, I'm not that conversant, I wish I was, but, sociologists or what anthropologists bring in terms of their understanding of culture. So I think that the study of rituals, as I mentioned earlier, so that's one area to broaden it. We have to move away. Ironically, we say behavior, everybody behaves in context, and then we just throw out context and we say, oh, everyone's going to respond to this nudge. And then we're surprised that everyone doesn't respond to that nudge. And we say, oh, nudging is bad. But, it's really a more nuanced sort of topic. So that's one, broadening the content. The second one is broadening the geography. So we know about how American or UK undergraduates behave, in a particular way. We don't know. And actually, this was another exciting piece that we had done with Busara, which is replicating some of the well-known biases in Kenya, in India. We actually don't know whether those would replicate, not replicate, et cetera, et cetera. So just broadening geographical scope where people say, oh, that classic social norms experiment you ran, that doesn't really work here, or that works under these conditions, so that we start to understand what's truly universal. For that, we need to have folks in those countries actually running those experiments. And then another way, obviously, related to that is just broadening, the experiences. So, having broadening diversity in behavioral science itself, right? Which is, having obviously gender diversity and race and sexual orientation. And you might say, well, why does that have anything to do with behavior science? And again, I think it's the question of, behavior is all about people, and the more different kinds of people study behavior science, I may not even know that something is not just natural and inherent. I tend to think of it, and as someone who's traveled to cultures, I can see so many things that I grew up in India thinking were perfectly natural. And when I come here, I realize actually, this isn't natural behavior. This is just a way in which I've been brought up. So I think that we need to broaden it in all those. And then finally, there's this issue of going beyond proof of concept, right, and scale up. I was in the middle of reading that lovely manual that I think Behavior Works, Monash University, and Behavioural Insights Group in Australia brought out on scale up, thinking about scale up. So I think it's really getting into the big, messy problems and saying, how do you scale up? So I don't think there's I'm not sure if there's a prioritization, but I think we have to do all of these things and just get it out of the that behavior science is about, it's about more than putting the fly in the urinal. And that's important to do, but that's not the only thing that we should be doing.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
So
amazing.
Then, I think, if you wrote this out a lot longer, this could be a very critique heavy book on behavioral science, which I'd very happily read.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So we always have this question towards the end of the podcast, just asking, kind of where do you see behavioral science going? Where do you see this progressing? So given that you've just given us a summary of how you would like to see behavioral science broaden, do you think this is within the immediate future, or do you think this is going to take quite a long time to actually be properly implemented?
So the one I'm seeing that is quite exciting is that whole emergence of Global South, both researchers and seeing the work there. I think that's the one that's the fastest.
Okay.
I think the one in terms of integrating it in organizations is still a little slower than I would like. So I would love to see a lot more in that. There's some great work, I think, University of Toronto, Dilip Soman and his team are doing, but, a lot more in that area. And the one about broadening the scope of behavior science, I think it's been done in academia, but I don't think the general public knows as much about it, right? So because the early books captured so much of the imagination, if you talk to people and say, what is behavior science? They'll tell you about the interesting nudge experiments, the organ donation, the fly. And I think there is a process there, but, sometimes I feel like, okay, if that's what they get and it's interesting, then why not start there? And, maybe that's the thing that captures their imagination. So I'm very excited to see what comes out in the next decade once we have people from all over the world really weighing in on behavior science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The more perspectives, the better for the whole discipline.
It'll be really cool. It'll be really cool to see that. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we're excited to see it too. I think, the discipline is so young. There's so much left to do. Yeah. I think we forget that sometimes when we see.
I totally agree. I just want to end on that note. In that sense, because it seems like, there are a lot of critiques, but it's breathtaking when you think it's really just been about 10 or 15 years. Psychologists have been studying a lot of this for a long time. Kahneman and Tversky started in the 70s. But just when you think about applications, the first nudge unit was just set up in, I think, 2009 or so, right? So it's like 10 years. It's a child, right?
Yeah. It's a baby.
And given that, it's been amazing to see the progress and to see where it's embedded into the consciousness of even somebody who doesn't know anything about behavioral science. So I think you're right. We should celebrate that while saying this is a good time before we sort of, fossilize into becoming just this irrelevant niche. This is a good time to push ourselves to say, what's the next frontier? What's the next frontier?
Well, I think we've got so much in just 1 hour about all the different ways that we can be pushing ourselves and not letting ourselves get too comfortable, with these flies and these defaults. So I think from Mela and I, Neela, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We've learned so much from you. And the very, very last thing, I guess, is for the listener, where can they find you? Where can they keep up to date with what's going on with your work and, your life and us as well?
I think I'm most active on Twitter, so you could probably find me there. I'm starting to get a web page together finally, but intent action gaps, so we shall see. So follow me on Twitter, or maybe LinkedIn, but mostly Twitter. And I just want to say that these kinds of conversations are so amazing. We need more of those. We need many, many, many more of these conversations because it's just a great way to exchange some of these ideas. And I'm even now thinking, oh, that's an interesting thought. I should go back and look at some of that and see that. So, I love what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are very, very happy and almost honored to have inspired you.
Yes,
sure.
I mean, imagine. Yes, and if you ever want to come back and have another inspiring conversation, we're here with our mics and recording equipment. So
don't be too open with your invitation. You never know.
Oh no, it's fine. We'll see you next week. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
So that was our amazing conversation with Neela Saldanha, and all I have to say is wow, and how much we managed to cover, and how much I'm still thinking about all of these new ideas about what we need to do to broaden behavioral science. Like, how do we push through this mold of there being sort of this one-way mirror between the West and the rest of the world and the global South, and start to have a dialogue really about all of the innovative stuff that's been going on in countries other than sort of Europe, and the US. And there's so much. What if there was anything that's really stuck in your brain, Mela? What is stuck with you from our conversation?
I don't think I can pick a single thing. I really, really enjoyed the conversation, but like you said, there was so much being mentioned. I just think in general, if there's one thing that I'd like to see implemented, it's a mobile lab. I'd love to be in a lab on a bus.
What a cool idea. I just love it. I can see it in my mind's eye, It's like, let's take the bus out on the road and run a few sessions. But it's so important, like how to get access to subjects and sort of populations of interest. It's, from the West, we basically just said, look, either it's, people come to us, or maybe we're interested, within a certain, profession within a company that we're going to try and recruit, or for everyone else, we can just do it online, right? Yeah. So, which is, maybe you can sort of see the thinking there, and that, okay, this is a cheap solution, a cheap, easy way to get access to these populations. But I mean, imagine, if we had these labs, actual labs set up, remote labs that can move into communities, or more actual physical labs that stay there when researchers come in and out of the country. Like, what an amazing resource that would be.
Yeah. I thought that was a great idea, and it just shows that within not every country has the infrastructure to do some type of research or to implement some type of nudge or any other type of intervention. But I think in a similar vein, wherever you are in the world, I think we've really overhyped the cheapness of a nudge, and sometimes the cheapness of certain interventions, where the true cost might actually come from overhauling an already existing and to some large extent functioning system. And that, to me, finally explains why there might be quite a large resistance for companies to not want to implement behavioral science, because we see a cheap enough intervention, but no one ever really talks about the cost of overhauling an entire system, because that's not that easy.
No, I mean, I think that's a key. It's not easy, it's not cheap, and it pushes against the status quo. I mean, I think Neela, her position or her experience within sort of marketing, shows that there are industries out there, well-established industries like advertising and marketing, that their job is to look at human behavior, right, in a sense. So it's difficult from outside of, maybe the more academic bubble, or maybe from, outside of pop behavioral science books, to really understand the distinction and the value added of a behavioral science team or unit within a corporation or a company that already has marketing people and advertising people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think broadening behavioral science, looking at more topics. I mean, Neela has mentioned research from several other researchers, looking more into rituals, which I think is definitely an undervalued topic within behavioral science. And maybe looking into slightly more philosophical areas or slightly more sociological areas,
Yes.
and really figuring out what's really going on, because to say that behavioral science only looks at directly observable and measurable behaviors is just really selling it short.
I agree.
And there is much more depth to be gained there, or width, or broadness, whichever term you would want to apply to it. But yeah, this entire broadening, so globally looking at different infrastructures, looking at different combinations and routes of how to become a behavioral scientist with different backgrounds, different perspectives, different point of views. It's just there's so much work to still be done here. There's no reason to get complacent.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I have been fascinated with the idea of empathy as like this concept. It's such a powerful concept, but the degree of empathy that you feel for someone else or a group of people, it bleeds into almost pretty much all domains of human behavior. But I mean, there's no clear pathway of how to study empathy as a behavioral economist, and I would love to do some work on that. So if anyone's listening that has any idea of the best ways to measure empathy or any research out there, let us know, because I would be super interested to hear that. But yeah, and I think it comes back to a lot of the things that we've spoken about in depth on this podcast with other people, other hybrids in particular, this gap and this bridge between academics and people in the applied space, or like managers even more broadly, and this gap really, it does nothing for our discipline, right? The longer we have this gap and the more prolonged and systematic it is, like the worse it is for everyone, because you're missing out on so many amazing perspectives of people on the ground who are, I guess, as Christian Hunt would say, risk radars, right? That they know, from their own experience, what the problems are, or can identify, okay, this actually would be something that people would respond well to. They have that experience, and we just need to get ourselves more connected. We need more hybrids, right? Essentially, and
absolutely,
yeah,
a hybrid community should be forthcoming.
Yes.
I love how I'm saying that as if I'm building it. I'm not starting anything here. I'd rather have a slightly more experienced hybrid started, and then I'll keep going. I'll sign up for the membership.
Oh, I thought you'd already made the website and everything. It's like a total Mela thing to do, right? You've already trademarked it.
No, absolutely not. I mean, maybe I should. Maybe we should. I've built one website in my life, and to be quite honest, I think that gave me enough of a headache to never do it again.
Yes. Okay. So I think that we speak for both of us that throughout this podcast series, we want to hear more from hybrids and build a hybrid community, but we also acknowledge that we are not experienced in the field. We are not yet hybrids. It's an aspiration, not a reality. And so we would very gladly step out of the way for a real hybrid with real experience to make something here for everyone. But yeah, I mean, I think on that note, I would just like to say again, thank you so much, Neela, for your time, for your insight, for allowing us to pick your brain and to learn so much. And all we hope is that you, as the listener, also enjoyed this episode and got something from it. Yeah, that's really all what it's all about. So thank you for listening. And, we definitely recommend following Neela and becoming a fan of her Twitter page. If that's one thing you do, it's just click that follow button.
Absolutely.
Other than that, that's all just to say, I guess, we'll see you next week for our next episode of the Questioning Behaviour podcast. We hope you'll stick around.
And we also hope you have a nice week. Later.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love